Live webinar. My name is Stephen and I will be the moderator of today's session. Before we get started, let me take a few minutes to go through some practical details with you. Please note that you can always join this webinar by Twitter using the hashtag FERMA webinar. And during this webinar, we really would like to hear from you, so do not hesitate to send questions, share your comments, challenge our ideas using the chat box, which is right at the bottom left of your screen. We will also have a few polling questions during the session, and they will appear right on your screen, and then you will be able to vote on your favorite answer. But at this point, I would like to introduce today's topic and speaker. We are here today to discuss environmental, social, and governance-related risk, also called ESG-related risk, and how enterprise risk management, that most of the companies use to manage risk, can support the identification, the assessment, and the mitigation of these risks. And to this end, I have two distinguished guests with me, Rodney Irwin and Paul Sobel. Rodney Irwin is a managing director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. He is responsible for redefining value and education programs, and he is also a member of the organization's senior management team. Welcome, Rodney.
Well, thank you.
Paul Sobel is a chairman of COSO, the well-known US private sector initiative for developing risk-related frameworks and guidance. He is widely recognized as a leading expert on governance, enterprise risk management, compliance, and internal control. Paul was a key member of COSO Advisory Council that provided input for the 2017 update of the ERM framework. Paul, welcome. I know it's very early in the US in Atlanta, so thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Tiffany.
Paul and Rodney, you will present us a guidance that your two organizations developed last year, which basically help risk managers, but also ESG specialists to apply enterprise risk management concepts and processes to ESG-related risk. But before I give you the floor, I would like to launch two first polling questions and ask the audience to basically set up the scene. And after, I would like to ask you to react to the answers. So the first question is, are ESG-related risk a priority for your organization? And you have 20 seconds to select your favorite answer. Okay, so we should be able to see the results in a couple of seconds. Okay, so medium for 56%, high for 35%, and low for 9%. Paul, does this result surprise you?
It does surprise me a little bit. Not that the low is as low as it is, because you would assume that people aren't dialing in if that many had low priorities here. But I'm surprised the high isn't a larger number. I read yesterday something from, I think it was the Harvard Business Review, study that they had done of, I think it was 70 interviews and some very large companies and large hedge funds and things like that, and they said the vast majority felt that ESG risks were some of the top ones on their list. So as I say, I'm a little bit surprised that this number isn't higher than it is.
Okay. And Irwin, Rodney, sorry, do you have a reaction?
I think I'm probably the opposite of Paul, because I've observed over the last few years that ESG-related risks are not necessarily getting the attention that they should be getting. So I sort of expected the high of 35% to perhaps be a little bit lower. So I think it just goes to prove you can't keep it. Nobody can be happy, really. So and some of the research we have done does indicate that there is a disconnect between the environmental, social, and governance functions within companies and risk management, which we'll explore later. So, I'm optimistic that with the audience that we have today, that we have an informed audience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, so we will know a little bit more about the audience with a second question, which will appear on the screen. Which is about the specific role that the audience is playing regarding ESG-related risks. So do you play a specific role regarding ESG-related risks in your organization? Yes, no, or you're planning to? Okay, so now we will see the results. Oh, okay, so 45% do play a role, 32% no, and 23% are planning to. Rodney, what are your views?
I'm a little bit confused, if I'm honest, because with 32% of the population saying that they don't play a specific role, I'm wondering how does that translate to the previous question, where we had 35% saying high and 56% saying medium, with only 9% saying low. So I'm curious as to who's doing this role if it's not the people on this call. And I'm assuming that perhaps I'm making a wrong assumption, but I'm assuming that the participants on this call are in the risk management function. So, but optimistic that 23% are planning to, and that 45% are already doing something is good news. But a little bit of a disconnect between this result and the previous one.
Yeah, true. Paul, would you like to add anything?
Perhaps a hypothesis. I was trying to anticipate where this vote may come out, and it's possible that almost a third of the audience that's saying no here, they may be involved in broader risk management without having a specific role related to ESG-related risks. And if so, then I could see this still being a pretty important webinar with very relevant information for them. Similar to Rodney, I'm encouraged by the planning to approaching a quarter of the voters. I think that's probably a trend we'll be seeing globally for the next few years as well.
Okay.
And hopefully today with this webinar that will inspire those that are planning to accelerate their plans, and for those that currently aren't, to perhaps inspire them to get more of a specific role by providing them with the tools that we have developed to support them.
Yeah, indeed. And it's a nice transition for me so that I can give you the floor, Rodney. And can you tell us a little bit more about the background of the project, how and why your two organizations decided to team up to develop such guidance?
Absolutely. So prior to my role at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, I had the job title of Group Director, Risk Management, Internal Control at a large multinational listed transport company based out of Amsterdam. And for the last 4 years of my role there, in addition, I looked after the company's sustainability reporting. I have a background as a chartered accountant, qualified in the United Kingdom, and so I came to this space as a compliance accountant. And I realized very early on that the risk management work that I was doing was very complementary to the work that my colleagues in the sustainability function were attempting to undertake. So when I joined the WBCSD in 2012, one of the first things I did was reach out to COSO in December of that year. It was just 6 weeks after I joined, and asked the then chair of the COSO board if they would be interested in discussing a collaboration. And today we're talking about the fruits of that 6-year journey that we've been on. But since I started in this space, I think there's been radical shifts in the perception of risk and the perception of ESG-related risks as they impact a particular business. And if we look at the slide that's in front here, you see an extract from the last 10 years of the World Economic Forum's risk reporting. So you can see here that just after the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of the risks that the World Economic Forum were saying were high impact, high likelihood, were in the financial space. That's what you see with the dark bluish color. But if you look at what's happened from 2011 onwards, you can see quite a significant shift in the replacement of financial risks by what we now know as environmental, social and governance risks. So if you look at the 2019, the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood are extreme weather events, natural disasters, and the failure of climate change mitigation strategies and adaptation. And then if you look then at the impact, again, you see natural disasters, climate change mitigation, and extreme weather events. And you also see water crises, which is colored pink here, and that's a social risk, a risk relating to access to safe, clean water for drinking as well as sanitation. And we see the emergence of governance risks relating to fraud and cyber attacks. So the landscape of risk management has changed. And I suppose what I already foresaw in 2012 is that the risk management functions in many companies were not addressing this correctly. So if we go to the next slide, hopefully, yes, we can see that even though we've known this for the last 10, 12 years with the World Economic Forum, this is not a new thing. And if we look back at corporate crises that have emerged dating back to the early 1970s, where we had issues with Ford, the Nestle baby milk scandal, for example, is still something that is fresh in people's minds, although Nestle has made significant progress and is now a leader in sustainable development since then. It's still something that is at forefront of people's minds. But if we take it through to the last 10 years, we're seeing the BP issue with Deepwater Horizon, the floods in Thailand that really disrupted production and had significant financial impacts on companies there. We had issues with Rana Plaza, which had implications for many companies in the textile industry, product recalls from General Motors, of course, Dieselgate and the issues that Volkswagen experienced, right through to the more recent issues relating to Uber and the social implications of their business model has had, and of course Wells Fargo, which has had significant issues with respect to mis-selling of products. So the ESG risks are real and they are happening to companies and they're having material impacts. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that indeed this has even moved into the last 12 months. So here's a slide that I think is designed to be quite provocative. We believe that risk, for example, climate change is a risk. I would argue it's not. Climate change is a reality. We are already experiencing climate change. 97% of the world's scientists believe that climate change is a reality. Therefore, predicting if climate change will happen is a futile exercise. And what risk managers need to be addressing is our business model, is our product base, is our material facilities exposed to the effects of climate change. And here are just some examples from Europe in the last 12 months. So we know that last year's summer was unprecedentedly warm. We know that that had implications in the water levels in the Rhine. And we know that companies that are dependent on the Rhine for the transportation of both raw materials as well as finished products had major implications. And BASF had to make a profit warning where they announced that the production of a particular chemical would be suspended because of inability to get the chemicals needed to make the product to their facilities in Germany. Solvay also was impacted by this issue, as was Shell. So these are real risks that companies have faced in the last reporting year that are the direct results of the effects of a natural capital or climate change issue. But then if we look at the other scenario, which is social issues, we're looking at what's happened in Brazil with Vale with respect to the dams there bursting and a significant loss of life, as well as the implications that the dam bursts have on the natural environment in a country that the world is dependent upon for making sure the rest of us have clean air. So I think my message is that we've known for some time that these issues are real, but they're becoming extremely significant for businesses. And here are 3 and 4 large companies who have had to adjust their business model, adjust their planning and their operations, and in some cases issue profit warnings as a direct result of risks emanating from climate change, as an example. So we go to the next slide. We also did some research in 2015 that confirmed that the current way in which companies exercise enterprise risk management is disconnected from the way in which the same company is looking at ESG-related risks. So this publication, which was published at Davos during the World Economic Forum's meeting in January 2016, confirmed a disconnect. What we saw is that there was a 1 in 3 chance of a company who disclosed a significant or material, and they used the word material, ESG risk in the sustainability report, was also being reflected in the risk disclosure. So a 1 in 3 chance. That reduced to a 1 in 9 chance for social risks, and increased to a 40% likelihood for climate change related risks. So what that said to me is that there was a disconnect between what the company was saying in one disclosure vehicle with respect to material ESG impacts and dependencies versus what was happening in the risk function. And when we triangulated that research by speaking to risk management and sustainability professionals within our population of 170 companies, we identified 8 reasons why this was happening. And in some cases, it was just because the 2 functions didn't even know that each other existed, or where they did know that each other existed, there was issues with respect to language, there was issues with respect to definition, and even when there was great collaboration, the risk management process didn't know how to treat these risks, either because they were too long in the future in terms of their potential impact, or because the prioritization mechanisms that the company used meant that they fell out within the time frame over which the company was looking. So bringing it all together, we know there's an issue with these risks. We know that companies are experiencing actual financial implications as a result, but we also know that there is a disconnect between the enterprise risk management function and the sustainability or ESG function within the company. And by collaborating with COSA, we attempted to address that bridge, and hence the guidance that we launched last year.
Okay.
So I think that the next slide just confirms that result. We saw of the 170 companies that we surveyed, 8% had full alignment, 57% had partial alignment, 35% had zero alignment, and I feel that that's really quite concerning, given that in the public domain there is already a disclosure confirming material ESG issues in the sustainability report, but not being reflected in risk. The average is 29%. So based with all of that, we went back to the COSO board and we said, how about joining forces? We are experts in sustainable development, you're experts in risk management. How can we provide guidance to help bridge this gap.
Okay. And Paul, then, what was your reaction when you heard from WBCSD, who wanted to work together with you? You were already undergoing some work to update the COSO ERM framework. So did it trigger this cooperation, or what was your reaction and how did you go about it?
Well, first, let me say that Rodney has had to deal with 3 COSO chairmen now. Back in 2012, the first one he brought it to. That was at a time when COSO was just finishing up its update of the internal control framework. And then almost immediately, with the new chairman, launched into the update of a risk management framework. So by the time I took over as COSO chair a little over a year ago, this kind of joint venture between the 2 organizations was already in flight. But it's something that made tremendous sense. So the slide that you're seeing right now hopefully is somewhat familiar to people on this webinar. And it's a new graphic for COSO. COSO has been kind of known for the COSO cube, which literally is a cube showing the interrelationship between the different components and objectives and parts of an organization. And originally that applied to both internal control and risk management. It still applies to internal control, so the cube is not gone. But with this update to the ERM framework, the advisory council felt very strongly that there needed to be a new graphic, something that better reflected the tone of the update. In fact, the title of this framework is Integrating with Strategy and Performance. And that's very different than something that can be depicted in a cube. So this graphic is intended to show really the stages of a business model, starting with the mission, vision, and core values, kind of why an organization exists, through to the development of strategy and business objectives, ultimately the implementation and performance of risk management. And if you do all of that well, you will have enhanced value. Those ribbons that are kind of weaving through it, some have likened it to a DNA strand, those actually reflect the 5 components that you can see right below it. And I'm not going to read through all these components, but it's intended to depict that these components do in fact weave their way through all aspects of an organization, affecting strategy development and ultimately performance. Now, you can also see on this slide that it lists 20 principles. Those principles are new to the updated framework, and frankly, I think do a very good job of articulating what needs to be present and functioning for risk management to be effective in an organization to ultimately achieve that enhanced value. Now, this is all well and good, but kind of thinking back to what Rodney was teeing up and the importance of ESG risks, we at COSO recognized that this is still a conceptual framework that can be applied really to any type of risk at all levels of an organization. And the opportunity to take a little deeper dive in the ESG risks was something that we felt made a lot of sense and was really part of the, I think, evolution of this framework. So as we move on to the next slide, you'll see something that's fairly similar. This is what the guidance looks like that we co-issued last October, and it might be small on your screens, but it is called Applying Enterprise Risk Management to Environmental, Social, and Governance-Related Risks. Now, what we've done is we've turned that, call it the DNA helix, on its side. And as you go through the different colors, those are the same colors as the COSO components were on the previous slide. The same components. The difference is that we've taken component number 3 on performance and divided that into 3 areas to help people identify ESG risks, assess and prioritize ESG risks, and then ultimately implement the responses to effectively manage ESG risks. So what this is telling us is that the guidance that was issued is organized the same way that the COSO ERM framework is organized. It links very well. All 20 principles are covered throughout this guidance, but it does a very effective job of, again, diving deeper so that readers can better understand how to apply those COSO components and principles, specifically as it relates to managing ESG related risks, hence the title. So if we move on to the next slide, this will just kind of summarize really how the guidance can help people. And I encourage people to download it. You can get it at either the COSO or WBCSD websites. It's a free download. It's fairly lengthy by design because there's a tremendous amount of information in there. It's not the sort of thing you curl up in front of a warm fire and read. It's definitely something you use a little bit more as a reference guide. But as you can see from these bullet points on the left, this guidance can be very helpful, kind of at a higher level, enhancing resilience. As some of the examples that Rodney brought up before, whether they're environmental, social, or governance, they can have a tremendous impact on an organization. And by being able to more effectively understand and manage those risks, it will enhance the resilience of the organization. The common language is something that has, I think, plagued risk managers for decades, and that is making sure that people are talking the same language. So when somebody says, well, even just societal or social risk, what does that mean? And making sure what this guidance can do is to help the risk managers and the sustainability managers be more aligned, to talk the same talk, so that they can then focus on how do we identify, assess, prioritize, and manage these risks. The third and fifth, in some respects, bullets almost go together here: improved resource deployment and realized efficiencies of scale. The name of the game here in risk management is you cannot manage all risks down to eliminate any exposure. Therefore, you have to make decisions, and good risk management is about making better decisions. Some of those decisions are around what types and the extent of resources to deploy to management of risks, and then how can you ultimately do so in an efficient way that you're not draining excessive resources from the organization. Now, having said that, it makes risk sound very negative, but notice that fourth bullet on there: enhanced pursuit of ESG-related opportunities. And that's an important but sometimes overlooked area that one can, in fact, by effectively understanding and managing their ESG risks, actually create opportunities that might help the organization be more successful, hopefully help the community and the environment be more successful, etc. So let's not focus solely on what I call the downside of risk, because there's an upside of ESG risks as well. And then finally, improved disclosures. There are other reference sources out there, but ultimately we need to make sure that the transparency of disclosures around ESG risks improves, so that investors and other organizations and stakeholders have a better understanding, really, of what the risk profile is for the organization and how they are assessing and trying to manage the ESG related risks. So again, I encourage people who haven't already seen it to go and download the free copy of this. It has a wealth of great examples in it. That's the expertise that WBCSD brought, and many references, to websites, etc., that can help you further your research in this area.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So before we launch the discussion, I'd like to turn to the audience with two further polling questions. And as before, Paul and Rodney, I would like to hear your reaction afterwards. So the first one is, to what extent do you work with ESG specialists? Do you have regular and close collaboration based on a clear mandate? Do you work with them on an occasional basis? There is no relationship and involvement at all? Or this basically dealing with ESG related risk is under your own responsibility? And also, I would like to make sure that you do not hesitate also to send your questions if you have some, and we will go through them during the Q&A session. So we will see the results. Okay, so half of the respondents collaborate on an occasional basis for 52%. Then 24% have no relationship at all with ESG specialists in their organization. 18% have regular close collaboration. And for 6%, this is under their own responsibility. Rodney, how do you interpret these results?
I think it's quite encouraging. 6% that already have ESG as part of their responsibility is a good thing to see. But if we look at the absolute, there's 76% of the respondents have some form of relationship, and I think that's a positive. For those that currently do have no relationship or involvement, then the fact that they're taking part in this webinar, I think, is in itself showing a degree of interest in the topic. And the guidance, as Paul has described, is definitely designed to help them move that to at least collaboration of some form. So yes, I'm encouraged by the results.
Okay, Paul, any reaction?
I think pretty similar to what Rodney just said. I was guessing that the occasional collaboration would be the largest amount, and clearly it is. And I think that reflects the fact that ESG risks are an important part of most organizations' risk profile. And regardless of what role you have, it's difficult not to have some collaboration to effectively understand and manage those risks. It'll be interesting to see over time which of those bars increases. As the hopefully no relationship goes down, does it slip under my responsibility? Will that go up? Or I'd say more likely it'll be the top one. Regular and close collaboration will hopefully go up as well. And the end of that is important. The clear mandate, that's really where it has to start at the top before you can get that regular and close collaboration. So again, echoing what Rodney said, I see some encouraging things here, and hopefully these bars will continue to improve in the future.
Yeah, and the results are also in line with the results of the FERMA European Risk Manager Survey of last year, where we had 71% of the respondents who said that they had regular or some form of relationship with ESG specialists. And so if we move on to the next question, which is about basically the challenges, to integrate ESG-related risk into the ERM process. So what is the greatest challenge to integrate ESG into the ERM process? Having limited knowledge on sustainability risk, having difficulty in quantifying sustainability risk. Well, the limited collaboration that you both mentioned between ESG and ERM specialists, the omission of opportunities or strategic risks, and the lack of support from board and top management, which can also be a challenge. Okay, so we should be able to see the results in a couple of seconds. Okay, so the first challenge identified by the audience is, the difficulty to quantify sustainability risk for 39%. Then it's a lack of support from the board, followed by the limited knowledge of sustainability risk. And then the collaboration comes after, between the lack of collaboration between ESG and ERM specialists. And finally, the omission of opportunities or strategic risk. Paul, can you What is your reaction? Would it, does it mirror, the challenges that you had listed?
Yeah, the top one, the highest voting one, difficulty quantifying sustainability risks. That doesn't really surprise me. I think we hear a lot about that in the marketplace. The good news is there is an increasing amount of guidance on, what does materiality mean when you're talking about ESG risks. It's not quite as quantifiable as you might get with most financial reporting type of risks. But I think there is a growing body of knowledge out there that will help organizations better understand and try to quantify sustainability risks. The other one, the second item, the highest vote of lack of support from board and top management. Again, not a surprise. I think that's one of the easier ones to address. And certainly Rodney's organization is doing a lot to try and increase visibility. COSO's is as well. In fact, I have presentations coming up in the next 6 months specifically to board members. One will be in Spain and one will be in Tanzania. And I think from a COSO standpoint, we're going to be trying to target more of that board and board committee level where we can, because that is really where it has to start. It starts with that tone at the top, and that support is ultimately what will make this more successful in the future.
Yeah. And Rodney, can you maybe provide some recommendation or advice on some of these challenges highlighted?
Yeah, I think the use of the word sustainability risks is perhaps part of the problem. Sustainability risks are business risks, they're operational risks, they're strategic risks, they're legal risks, and they are financial risks. So when people say they have difficulty quantifying sustainability risks, I would turn that around and say, do you have difficulty quantifying operational risks? So if we look at the examples that I provided earlier with, say, BASF, Solvay, Shell, Vale, they've had to quantify those risks because they've had operational significance. And I think this is where, we look at the limited collaboration or limited knowledge at 14 and 16%. I think, for me, risk management starts off by having meaningful conversations. And if the sustainability and the risk management professionals can come together, you will see that the sorts of exposures and opportunities that a company faces are actually strategic, operational, legal, and financial risks, which is what the risk management community have always been comfortable dealing with. And therefore, there are ways around that. And the guidance is peppered with examples of how companies can do this. For example, in Chapter 2, a lot of guidance is provided by helping companies look at the impacts and dependencies that a particular organization, an entity, a business unit, even a facility has in relation to environmental, social, and human capital exposures and opportunities, impacts and dependencies. And it brings you through 2 documents called the Natural Capital Protocol and the Human and Social Capital Protocol, both of which are designed specifically to help with that quantification process. There it allows you to access tried and tested results that allow you to determine either in monetary terms or in other quantitative terms the impacts and dependencies that you have. There's a wealth of resources out there, and the guidance brings it all together and puts it in one place. The starting point is by actually just having a good conversation between the risk management community and the sustainability community. With respect to the board, I think it's really quite worrying that in this day and age, the lack of tone at the top is still cited as a problem. The United Nations Environment Programme launched a document in 2015 called Fiduciary Duties, 21st Century Approach. And I would recommend that those that are interested in looking at the governance issues related to ESG-related risks and risk management in general is to have a look at that document, because ESG issues and opportunities are indeed fiduciary responsibilities, and that companies therefore need to ensure that the board is educated and understands that it needs to discharge its duties as it does with any other exposure or opportunity. So the guidance provides a wealth of resources like that you can access in one place.
Mm-hmm. And about the collaboration between the two, how would you foster it? How would you encourage it? Who should start, for instance, within the company?
Well, basically, if anybody's on this call today and are interested in having a conversation with their counterpart, and I'm assuming that FERMA's webinar is attracting mostly a risk management audience, then what's stopping you picking up the phone, finding out who looks after sustainability within your organization and inviting them for a coffee and having this conversation. Download the guidance. There's an executive summary which is more palatable to read. It gives you all of the initial examples. And of course, you can also contact us for additional support. At WBCSD, we have developed a board game to help with the conversation, which is a fun way of introducing this conversation. But we've also developed diagnostic tools to help risk management and sustainability understand where they are today, vis-a-vis the guidance and its ambitions, and where they want to be, and how they can go forward with that. We've also developed training materials that we will be rolling out this year, including a CPE credit-bearing course that I think attracts 8 CPE credits towards professional designation. So there's a wealth of resources out there, but it starts by somebody picking up the phone and saying, I've been on this webinar, I think we should talk.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, do you have any experience about how to facilitate the process, to start the process? Because I think this is really a key question for risk managers who want to do something, but don't know where to start.
Yeah, it's. I think Rodney did touch on it pretty well. What I found in my organization, so COSO is a part-time gig for me. I still have a full-time job. I'm Chief Risk Officer at Georgia Pacific here in Atlanta. And what I have done, as soon as that ESG guidance, actually, even with the draft, I sent it out to people responsible for environmental risks and similar types of risks, and said, hey, I think you need to look at this. So regardless of why you are on this webinar, get that guidance, try to absorb the key talking points. And I'm glad Rodney mentioned the executive summary, because that is one you could curl up in front of a fire and read through quite quickly and probably enjoy. But somebody has to start that conversation, and it might as well be those of you who are on this call.
And you also both mentioned the fact there was no common language between risk management specialists and ESG specialists. So what are your advice? So what kind of is it a specific jargon that everybody should use, or how do you bridge this gap?
Within the sustainability world, I've noticed that those that work in the space have developed their own language. They have taken common usage terms and added their own definition, and that has not been helpful. And over the past few years, there's been a lot of businesses that have been very frustrated by this seemingly growth in language choices that sustainability professionals are using. The guidance, however, has been written very carefully to bring both communities together, and where we have felt it necessary, we have provided the common language that they should be using. At the end of the day, sustainability or risk management don't exist unless the company is wanting both to exist. And as I've said before, sustainability is not a report, it's not a department, it's not a job title. It's actually the end result of a strategy that understands how the company and its products and its services have impacts and dependencies on other forms of capital, in addition to financial capital. So we need to make sure that we speak the language of the business, and where possible, make sure that we don't confuse things by bringing in other popular terminologies that will not last, will not be as helpful as using the language of the business. So the first thing is speak the language of the decision makers in your company. and show them that, what we're trying to achieve here is about helping them be even more successful than they already are. It's about value preservation and also value creation. And that's basically what every company is trying to achieve. So I think we can get hung up on the language differences, but the starting point is by making sure you speak the language of your business and you don't introduce new terminologies for the sake of it. Sustainability risks are business risks, they're operational risks, they're strategic risks. And if you frame it that way, then you're not getting into that, oh, it's hard to quantify or it's too difficult. It's what, as we've already shown from the examples, they're real business risks. And if you frame it in that way, then you'll be more likely to be successful.
Yeah, for me, that was probably the most eye-opening part of going through this process with WBCSD. Reading through the drafts and then comments and ultimately the final document, I echo what Rodney says. It really helped me better understand and appreciate the importance of the language, the importance of being able to communicate on the same terms, and recognizing that the investment community is already talking this language. We have to talk it as well. And as I say, as I went through this, it was very eye-opening for me, learning more about how to best communicate the impact that ESG risk can have on an organization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And we are receiving also some quite a lot of questions about, this issue of common language, how to create a taxonomy for ESG-related risks. So we really see that this is an issue that matters. Another comment that we have received is that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are too general, state-related. What are your views?
Well, the SDGs have been developed in 2015 as the development agenda for the world. There are 17 SDGs and they cover a wide range of things, that from climate change through to life on land, life in sea, human rights, education, etc. And businesses have been involved in this space for the first time. So when the Millennium Development Goals were launched in the year 2000, the business community wasn't really involved. That wasn't the case in 2015 when the business community was involved. And I think companies are curious about the SDGs, not only because they want to be able to understand what their businesses are doing in terms of perhaps improving the development agenda, but more importantly, because if the SDGs are to be fulfilled, they will generate a 22 trillion increase in the global economy. So there is a huge opportunity there for business to pursue that. But that means being able to be very discerning about your impacts and dependencies and understanding where you can not only manage the impacts that you have that perhaps aren't as positive as they could be, and where you can pursue opportunities. So the SDGs are something that will complement the guidance that we have talked about, and indeed it's referenced in there in several occasions. But this, again, it goes back to the agenda. These things are all there. Some of them are very generic, some of them are very detailed. The SDGs have 169 targets, for example, and KPIs. No business uses that to manage itself. So therefore, it's about taking control of what it is that you can influence and the ones that you can pursue. And again, the guidance will help you with that. But the starting point, as I said, is downloading it, getting meaningful conversations internally. And the chances are that the sustainability function within the company is already working on the SDGs in some way. We know from other work that we do at the WBCSD that over the last 3 or 4 years, businesses are starting to disclose impacts and dependencies and opportunities relating to the SDGs. So within the company, there is probably already quite a bit of work being done. And again, by having those conversations, you'll be able to find out more.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul and Rodney. Well, unfortunately, the webinar has end. So as you were saying, I invite you to download really this very practical guidance on the WBCSD and COSO websites. If you want to also know more, you can attend the masterclass at the FERMA forum in Berlin that Rodney will be